Physics in video games. In many games, physics make up the difference between moving your character and actually controlling them, if done well, of course. Unique physics engines are pretty common in 3D games, although they of course can appear in 2D games as well. A great recent example of this would be Noita, the basic premise of Noita being that every pixel is physically simulated. This, along with the extremely in-depth customization of magic wands, makes Noita give off this feeling of endless possibilities. The player is given complete freedom and even encouraged to push the physics of Noita to its absolute limits and break the game. But what if we stripped Noita bare of its RPG elements, its magic, and basically all of its sprite work and just left behind the physics? You'd probably get something like this. If you're old like me, you may remember a series of browser games called Falling Sand Game or Powder Toy, where this concept of physically simulated pixels was first introduced, as far as I can tell. Now, I know I said browser games, but calling these games is really a stretch. When you take a physics engine and just kind of shake it around, it's more akin to a fidget toy. I believe this is what the kids call oddly satisfying. There's no real game yet, there's no winning or losing, you're just blowing stuff up for fun. But when we blur this line between game and physics toy, creating a game within the confines of a physics engine is where we get the mythical sandbox game. Sandbox games are really hard to get right. Not only do the physics that build the very world itself have to hold up, but the game also has to be fun. Otherwise, you might as well take the game parts away and just let me play with my virtual fidget spinner.
Oh no, I made them mad and they're coming to kill me.
So how would one Japanese developer take this sandbox he had created and make it into a fun, engaging game that used state-of-the-art physics to its advantage? I don't know. Anyways, let's talk about stick figures. We all love them. We've all drawn them at some point in our lives. Look, I just did it while I recorded me saying that. Stick figures may very well be the one thread that connects all of humanity together. It's an artistic medium every human being can relate to, mostly because they're the most simple thing to draw, like, look, I just drew another one. They're also extremely versatile, and you can pretty much put them in any scenario. This is why I think stick figure animations and games and comics blew up on the early 2000s internet. Anybody can make a stick figure animation, or even a stick figure game? Yeah, stick figure games were everywhere on the internet, so much so that they even had websites solely dedicated to hosting stick figure games and other content. So if stick figures can be anything and do anything, what if I made a stick figure RPG? Oh, sorry, not that one. I'm talking about Stick Ranger, an RPG released in 2008 by the independent Japanese developer Hassie. At least I think that's how you pronounce it. Released on their website Danball. Hassie had worked on the aforementioned Powder game and developed Stick Ranger within the same custom engine in JavaScript. This game is a great example of smashing two genres together you wouldn't normally expect and making something fun and interesting. Despite being built on the basis of a literal sandbox, Stick Ranger is an action RPG. Quite the departure from filling a box of C4 with a colony of ants and then blowing it all up with a laser beam. But ironically enough, Stick Ranger still retains a lot of that sandboxy feel because you don't fully control the action. As opposed to controlling the characters yourself, your team of little flaccid stickmen will attack autonomously. Sure, you can pick them up and toss them around, but for the most part you sit back and watch, almost like a simulation of sorts. For this reason, carefully speccing your team with the right weapons and stats is hugely important. But there are times when you, being the benevolent god that you are forced to step in. Like when your guys get stuck, or shoot into a wall, or run into an enemy and nearly die so you have to launch them into orbit, or they eat the health pickup when they're at 99% health and your entire backline is almost dead. See, this is why Stick Ranger is great, because when you lose, you can shift the blame onto the characters and then intervene for some divine punishment. In an adventure of 4 stickmans, and with 8 classes to choose from, including being able to select the same class multiple times, there are lots of ways to mix and match a team. Boxer and Gladiator for melee, Angel and Sniper and Magician for more range and AoE, Priest for support, and Gunner for gun. So you could try to balance out your team and go for a good spread of range and melee classes, or you could just go 4 gunners. Although they can fulfill similar roles, the classes are all distinct enough to encourage multiple different playthroughs just to see who does what. But once you've got a team lined up and start the game, you are greeted to the vast world map of Stick Ranger. I mean, just look at how huge this thing is. You saw that sick intro sequence. Something I love about the map is that even when you first start the game, you have the freedom to scroll all the way to the end just to see what lies ahead of you. It really makes the world feel big and shows you just how far you have to go before you reach the end. This is a bit of a personal aside, but seeing big world maps like this in a game like floods me with adrenaline for some reason. I think Mario games have permanently rewired my brain to just get unreasonably hyped when I see a big map that has distinct biomes in it, like deserts and whatnot, but we've got a long way to go, so let's head to the first level, Opening Street. Once you've dropped in, what is the first thing that you notice? Yeah, why are they walking like that? Since the movement of the stickmen is entirely physics-based, they tend to look a little silly when they move, but for being made in 2008 in JavaScript, the animation is honestly quite impressive. In particular, watching the sniper pull the string of the bow back and fire is, once again, oddly satisfying. How the class's attack is also based heavily on the physics engine itself. For example, Boxer has the shortest range because he has to get up close to wildly flap his noodle arms around and hit the enemies. Therefore, upgrading his speed will directly upgrade his damage output since he is physically swinging his arms faster. Since you don't directly control your team, playing around with what classes have synergy and just dropping them into the wild and watching them hop around can sometimes be the most fun part of the game. Makes it feel even more like a sandbox than an ARPG. I mean, just watching a full team of boxers go absolutely bonkers on some poor defenseless level 1 enemies is entertaining enough. Now, I hope I'm not making it sound like the game is boring by saying you don't control your characters. I just want to emphasize how strong the basis of the game's physics are first before any actual player input is added into the mix. In fact, saying you don't really control the characters is kind of misleading, and I've actually been gaslighting you this whole time. To keep Stick Ranger from being just an idle game where you watch wacky waving inflatable arm flailing tube men run around and hit stuff, there are actually some pretty ingenious design choices. So after your little stick guys get done ripping apart the enemies on screen, what happens next? This is where the player might realize for the first time, oh, I get to actually play the game, and start tossing their guys around. Unless you discovered that you could do this in the title screen, of course. You might also realize that items and jelly-filled donuts on the ground are stationary, and your stickmen do not go after them automatically like they do with enemies, even if they are low on health, thus forcing player input. Not only that, but you can't even proceed to the next part of the level without dragging a party member all the way to the edge of the screen and touching the next sign. So stickmen will stay completely still unless moved by a player or provoked by enemies, and even then, your party members will only approach enemies if they are within range, and vice versa. If they aren't close enough to each other, combat can't start, the game can't continue, and my AFK idle game is completely ruined because I have to actually play. So okay, you can't sit back and watch the game play itself. You'll especially start to notice this if you get low on health. By default, your stickmen will not charge into combat if they're close to dying. So you want to keep them alive by dragging their faces across the dirt until the health pickup ends up in their gullet and they can get back in the fight. But if you're not entirely paying attention, the backliners with like 99% of their health still remaining might end up grabbing the health drops your frontliners so desperately need. It seems your teammates are not very good at sharing, but something they do share is experience points. Wow, what a smooth transition that was. Like any RPG, defeating enemies grants you experience. Each time you level up, you can apply your newly earned skill points into either life, strength, dexterity, or magic. Pretty standard stuff. But here's where things get interesting. Aside from LP, leveling those other 3 stats does a completely different thing for each class individually. So leveling the strength stat across your entire team will have widely different results per stickman, unless you're based and your team is entirely gunners. Let me give you an example. For Boxer, it's pretty cut and dry. Strength increases damage, Dex increases the speed of his windmill arms, effectively increasing his DPS, and magic will increase how frequently his magic attacks proc, assuming you're using a magic weapon. Straightforward. Now let's compare that to leveling up the gunner. Strength still increases his damage, but by a 2% increase as opposed to Boxer's flat point increase. Increasing his dexterity does whatever the hell that is. And what does increasing his magic do? Make his magic attacks do more damage? No. It will instead reduce the gold you pay every time you shoot a bullet. What, you thought getting to shoot a rocket launcher would be free? Okay, so that all sounds confusing, but I think the obscure leveling system actually works to Stick Ranger's benefit. Gotta recognize where my man Hafai5II is coming from. Again, this game is built upon a sandbox, so it makes sense that playing with the mechanics of the RPG elements would be a bit more abstract and experimental. And it's not like they're random. In fact, the game actually shows you how your stats are increasing when you allocate skill points. It just takes some trial and error to find out exactly what you're doing. And a magnifying glass. So if you actually pay attention to the fine print, you'll realize that leveling Magician's Strength does not increase his attack, but leveling Magic does, which makes sense. You might also come to realize that the Priest is apparently a Giga Chad, because no matter how you level him, his aura always increases. This is where Stick Ranger truly shines, in my opinion. Even if its mechanics seem incomprehensive or quirky at times, it still manages to be intuitive under the surface without you really knowing it. Take, for instance, the enemies and the map.
Here is the map. Where do you wish to go?
The map is divided into numbered series of levels, usually related to a biome of some kind, and within those biomes are the types of enemies you might expect to be there. Enemies themselves are basically a set of pre-built parts Frankenstein together. Each enemy has a body, a head, and a color. This is how the game communicates to the player what to expect from a certain enemy. Enemies with a similar color or head aren't necessarily related, but all enemies with a certain body will always have the same movements. So I guess you could say the body is like the genus and the head/color is like the species. Yeah, this is some real kings play chess on fuzzy green squares type stuff right here. Basically what I'm saying is, when you enter the cave levels, you can reasonably assume you're gonna find some bat enemies, and you can definitely expect all the bat enemies to flap around and be really annoying to kill unless you have tons of range in your party. Similarly, when entering the desert and you see the cactus enemies, what do you expect them to do? Yeah, nothing until your melee attackers get close and you realize you made a grave mistake. However, when you run into another cactus with a different head and or color, that's when the cogs might start to turn. You might think, okay, this cactus is probably not gonna move, but what if its attacks are different? What if, I don't know, the blue cactus does elemental ice damage or something? Well, guess what? You're absolutely right. I know this all sounds really obvious, like, duh, enemies that look different can be reasonably expected to be different. But it's little details like this that make Stick Ranger feel really thought out to me. Introducing something to the player, then reiterating on it later to create a challenge and keep the game fresh within its own limitations. And I think the first level, Opening Street, does all of this flawlessly. Let's pretend this is my first time playing Stick Ranger. For the first couple screens, I run into these little fodder guys who just walk back and forth and do this little wimpy attack. Then I get introduced to this red version of the same enemy. He's noticeably different because of his color and that off-putting smile. He just looks a bit more threatening, but whatever, no problem for me. But then I start to see him more frequently. I realize he's a little tankier than the other guys and does a little more damage. Eventually, he becomes the most common enemy in the level until...
What in oblivion is that?
This guy is way different. He shoots projectiles, which is an attack pattern I have yet to see. Since there's only one blue X-Walker, his attacks are easy enough to get used to on their own. This will encourage me to become familiar with the concepts of projectiles and maybe even dodging them. This new skill is then tested in the next few screens where the enemy is a lot more frequent until finally... the boss room. You are now face to face with the first boss of Stick Ranger. Piecing together all the knowledge we have accumulated over the past 9 screens of enemies, what can you surmise that this boss will do? Well, he is a big smiley head, and even though those red smiley head guys from before were a little tough, they never shot like projectiles or anything, so there's no way this guy will... In my opinion, this is one of the most ingeniously crafted first level bosses ever. It stays somewhat familiar to subvert your expectations while also providing a pretty tough challenge that teaches the player an absolutely necessary tool they'll need to learn for the whole game. Positioning your stickmen. Luckily, Opening Street is a great intro level because it's a big, wide, flat, boring line with a bunch of super wimpy enemies who basically just sit still waiting for you to finish them. This is to ease you into the idea of moving your characters manually, but the very next stages, Grasslands and Hill Country, introduce a procedurally generated terrain with tall hills or even floating islands. I guess they're supposed to be the face of a cliff jutting out from the background, but the graphics aren't exactly doing the game any favors. These immediately become road bumps for range classes and melee classes alike. Either their attacks get completely blocked by a wall, or they do this. So again, the player is forced to pick up and drop the stickmen into better positions. In fact, a more keen player may discover that they might be able to make use of the terrain to their advantage. These early levels teach you that moving your stickmen to more advantageous positions or simply to avoid dying is crucial. It's important to realize that they will charge into battle like they're storming the beaches of Normandy without a second thought, but they cannot dodge on their own. In fact, a lot of the time they will run into or stand inside of enemy attacks, and it's up to you, the player, to make sure they don't sit there and get rotisserie chickened. I mean, this game basically becomes a bullet hell later on, and having to manage all 4 of your stick figures at once is like trying to keep 4 toddlers from sticking a fork in the electrical outlet. But we're jumping ahead a little. Where was I? Oh yeah. I know that little make up a guy segment a couple paragraphs ago where I pretended to be someone playing for the first time was really cute and funny, and you should like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell. But honestly, a lot of it is kind of BS. Many players, in fact, I'd argue the majority of players, won't be playing exactly as predicted and might just charge through everything without thinking. So the developer has to set some kind of wall in place. You may or may not have noticed that on every screen, you can actually skip to the next area without clearing all the enemies first, except for, of course, the boss room. This is very smart for a couple of reasons. One, a noobish player, aka me as a 10-year-old, might have attempted to outsmart the game and skip everything to then be met with an unskippable giant boss who just obliterates them in 2 seconds. So now I know I probably shouldn't do that. And 2, it teaches you that if you may need to come back to the boss later to grind for an item or something, you can do so fairly easily efficiently without having to sift through all the enemies on prior screens. So even if you skipped over the blue X-Walker enemies or actually fought them but didn't make much effort to avoid their attacks, you're definitely going to have to change things up when you get to the boss. And this is probably the first time your poor stick figures are going to die. If one of your characters dies, having to revive them mid-fight is incredibly expensive, sometimes exponentially more so than just leaving the fight and healing at the town. This is because healing at the inn is a measly $1 per missing health point, whereas reviving a teammate costs you 10% of all your money, and reviving doesn't even restore all your health. So if 2 or more party members end up dying, God forbid, you're honestly better off just taking the L and retreating to not have to pay that big-ass hospital bill. I mean, look at these guys. Do you think any health insurance firm would cover this? So you can revive if you're really close to beating the boss and you're absolutely certain you can win, or you can run away back to the map screen.
Like a little bitch!
Obviously, the latter is the much easier and safer and cost-effective option, but the secret third option is to just be goated to the game and dodge every enemy attack and be efficient at picking up onigiris whenever they fall. Like me. But no matter what path you choose, you can't unlock the next stage and progress until you beat the boss and drag your last remaining crippled stickman across the scattered limbs of his allies and onto that precious sign. So let's do this. Yeah, this might be a good time to talk about drops. Item drop rates are the lifeblood of an RPG, and Stick Ranger is no different. When killing an enemy, they'll either drop some moolah, an onigiri to fill some missing health, shiny new weapons to equip, or composition items, which are items that you attach to weapons to give them new effects. Tacking compo items onto the weapons you find is the true backbone of building your team, and honestly, it's one of the most fun parts of the game. This is where stick boys become stick men. Weapons you find have 2 slots available for compo items. Think slotted items from Diablo. Hey, wait a minute. These compo items have a huge variety of uses, and discovering new ones and seeing which weapons they have synergy with is a fun little game of chemistry. But you still have to be mindful of what items you put where. Once you stick a compo item onto a weapon, it cannot be removed, although it can be overwritten by another one. Most compo items usually stick to a common theme. The stones give flat stat increases, jewels grant elemental damage, cards do all kinds of wacky stuff, and there's a ton more I don't have time to get into because there's like over 300 of them, and not all of them are compatible with every weapon. Since weapons are typically a bit more rare to drop than combo items, mostly because of the sheer amount of compo items in the game, oftentimes I find myself discovering a really cool sounding card or something and building around that, as opposed to finding a good weapon and finding compo items to slot into it. It just really encourages you to keep grinding, killing enemies for drops, and experimenting with your team. Realistically, you're more than likely going to find a lot of compo items and weapons and end up running out of inventory space rather than hunting for specific items and being unable to find them. And you do have the option to buy items you might have missed later, but unless you have the gold for that, you're probably going to end up having to really grind for what you want if you missed it or realized later that you actually needed the thing you sold like 2 levels ago, which kind of brings me to some of the negatives about Stick Ranger. Okay, so it's no secret that RPGs, especially JRPGs, are quite the grind fest. Any seasoned veteran of the genre probably enjoys grinding, but most of the time the inevitable mass genocide of enemies is at least cushioned with nice visuals or punchy and satisfying sound effects to make you feel like not shooting yourself. What do you get in Stick Ranger in terms of sound effects or music? Yeah, you're listening to it. Slaughtering dozens of little smiley face guys while grinding for a 1% drop rate item isn't exactly the most exciting task when you've got a permanent black void and all the graphical fidelity of a light bright staring back at you. To be fair, the mobile port of Stick Ranger actually adds some sound effects. Yeah, never mind. Now, like I said before, grinding in Stick Ranger is fairly painless for the most part, since you can jump in and out of levels pretty freely. And I'd say the visuals are at least satisfying enough to watch. Seeing damage numbers pour out of enemies like a fountain is pretty entertaining, if not a little overstimulating. Loot drops are frequent enough, and at the very least, enemies tend to drop items that may become necessary in future levels soon to come. But unless you're really familiar with the game or have the wiki open on your other monitor, it's very possible to miss an important item in the ocean of enemy corpses. I mean, come on, the average player isn't going to know what to do with all this. But beyond that, I think maybe the biggest flaw that the game has at a deeper level is its difficulty curve. Stick Ranger gets hard. And I'll be the first to admit, I've never actually beaten the game. Yeah, I know, but you try beating it and get back to me, okay? And don't get me wrong, I love a challenge, but there are multiple points throughout the game where the difficulty curve might as well just be a 90-degree angle. A perfect example of this is one of the game's biggest hurdles, the second mega boss. Up until this point, Stick Ranger has been fairly challenging, but nothing crazy. By now, you've probably got a good grasp of moving your stick figures around and dodging enemy attacks, but when it comes to items, you're pretty much just banging rocks together. It's fairly easy to kind of bulldoze through the game without really paying attention to your build thus far, but once you reach the submarine shrine, things start to get dire. This is arguably the game's biggest wall. It's certainly the most well known. It's not like the boss does a ton of damage or anything, but his attack pattern pretty much completely invalidates your entire party if you don't play around it. You're not playing Stick Ranger anymore, little bro. You're playing Submarine Shrine Boss Simulator. So let me break it down for you. This is not the boss. It may look like the boss, and it may be listed as the boss on the wiki, but it is not. The real boss is this. The eel enemy that is quote-unquote actually the boss is easy enough to deal with. All he does is run away and pepper your team with fire. Who cares? These snowflake mines, aka the real boss, make this fight outlandishly difficult and frustrating. They will home in on the closest stickman and freeze them solid for a few seconds, during which they cannot move, attack, or even be moved by the player. Don't worry, they can still take damage though. And since they're frozen and the eel continues to run while your non-frozen stickmen chase it down, they end up getting frozen. Until one by one, your entire team is a bunch of popsicles being roasted over a campfire. Shouldn't that thaw them out or something? God, this game is so unrealistic. Being unable to manually click and position your stickmen fundamentally goes against every prior strategy in the game. It's one of the key parts of winning taught to the player as early as the first level. Okay, so how do you win? This is one of the few times where the items in your party matter way more than direct player input. The apparent strategy given by the game is to add at least one freeze charm onto your team. This is pretty obviously the intended way to beat the boss, since the freeze charm is found in one of the levels directly leading up to it, but it is possible to win without it. It's just a lot more tedious and time consuming and quite frankly cheesy. By adding a freeze charm to a stickman's weapon, you have an 80% chance to completely ignore the boss's freezing effect upon taking the hit, but notice that's 80% and not 100%. So if you have a frontliner to tank all the snowflakes for you, he's still going to get frozen eventually and all your teammates will soon follow. And even if you're really good at tanking those snowflakes, the eel is so slippery that the snowflake is almost guaranteed to sneak by you once or twice and hit your teammates anyways, unless you really want to give every single teammate a freeze charm, but that would take even more grinding. And remember, weapons only have 2 combo item slots, so adding a freeze charm takes up a precious slot. So if you like how your weapon is currently slotted and don't want to throw away a slot just for this one boss, you gotta get a spare weapon, which again means more grinding. But this is a pretty frustrating boss, even if you don't mind the grind. Even if you have stronger range characters and just use your melees as a meat shield while the backline whittles down the eel, it's possible, but it just takes forever. So the game doesn't exactly force you to build the freeze charm to beat this boss, but let's be honest, it basically forces you to build a freeze charm, okay? I'm not mad. Plus, enemies who freeze you are already fairly uncommon. I mean, the next series of levels directly after this is the desert, so it seems like the freeze charm is kind of a one-time use case, especially since the next time you might need a freeze charm, that weapon you had it on to begin with is now significantly underpowered. So what do you have to do? Grind again. Okay, but items aside, what if you're simply underleveled? Even though I think Stick Ranger does a great job of communicating things to the player, I'd say they drop the ball when it comes to how gaining XP works. Stick Ranger uses a proximal leveling system, meaning the closer you are to the enemy's level, the more XP you will get. So if you are too overleveled or even underleveled for an enemy, you won't get nearly as much XP as you would otherwise. This system is actually pretty smart, but where does the game even tell you this? The short answer is that it doesn't. You kind of just have to pay attention to how much your XP is going up as you defeat enemies. But it does tell you their levels in game if you buy the book at the village. Oh yeah, let me just go do that real quick.
Oh my goodness!
These books are ridiculously expensive, and if you really want to know how high level the Submarine Shrine boss is so you can be sure that you're fighting it at the right level, but you need the gold to buy the book, can you take a wild guess as to what you need to do? Okay, maybe I'm being a little unfair. I think Submarine Shrine boss is probably the most egregious example of this issue. Although it does feel a bit more like an item check than a simple change in strategy, I can understand the reasoning behind its design. They don't want you to just steamroll through the game without ever being conscious about your build, but what if the the problem is not your items, it's your party. Skill points you allocate cannot be undone, and even if you are a wiki head brainlet like me, using SP properly is harder than doing your taxes, which of course I don't know how to do. So if you're in really deep with like a max range sniper but no damage to compensate for it, and you come to an enemy that just closes the gap instantly, are you completely screwed? Well, not completely. Later in the game you come across the forget tree, which lets you revert skill points at a hefty cost, but that's pretty late in the game, and once again, what if you don't have the money? Can you take a wild guess as to... Okay, we're done with that bit, you get the idea. So a lot of the problems harken back to heavy amounts of grinding, and hey, it's a literal JRPG. Grinding is kind of in the genre's DNA. But I think the appeal of Stick Ranger goes far beyond its RPG systems and trying to be as optimal as possible. Most of the fun comes from discovering a weird looking new enemy and seeing what it does, using cool new weapons that you find, exploring new maps, just watching the stickmen frolic. I mean, can you really get mad at these little guys? All in all, Stick Ranger is a game about experimentation. I think that, in a way, it's really not too far from the sandbox that it was born from. In spite of its flaws, I think Stick Ranger still strongly holds up to this day. It's a surprisingly engaging, albeit simple browser RPG that's actually pretty damn challenging, maybe too much at times. But I think it's more about playing around and having fun and challenging yourself than ultimately beating the game. But I don't know, maybe I'm just off the copium because I've never actually beaten it. Hassie still continues to make games to this day, with Stick Ranger 2 being frequently updated. The developer continues to support the original though, with one of the most recent updates being a bug fix for the versus mode. Oh yeah, there's an entire PvP mode that I didn't even touch on in this video. Stick Ranger is a great example of how you can take a sandbox physics engine and do something completely unexpected with it, but it doesn't stray too far, which I think is important. Some of the most fun games in Gmod, a game based on a first-person shooter engine, are the ones where shooting isn't even necessarily the primary focus, but it still plays a part. However, you wouldn't directly compare TTT to Counter-Strike Source, even though they're basically the same game. They are completely different. But even without Source Engine, TTT is just Among Us, and Dark RP is just, I don't know, Second Life. So even though Stick Ranger twists the nature of its funky sandbox engine and becomes something completely new, it still manages to stick to its roots. Holy moly, another video in the books. Thank you so much for watching. And I'm sorry that this video took so long to come out. Like, this year has just absolutely flown by, and it's crazy to say, but like, I didn't start this really that long after my last video, which was in like February. So, I mean, it's taken me almost a whole year just to finish this video for many, many reasons. So much has been going on. I've had a very busy and exciting and honestly great year. And I hope you have too, if you're watching this. Thank you. But there's just been, even before I started making this video, like editing and everything, I had this idea for this video because I really love Stick Ranger, and like years ago, literally I wrote a script, many scripts actually, back in like 2022, and since then I've been like trying to start this video, but I didn't expect it to be such an undertaking. There was so much editing, a lot of gameplay stuff. It was a pretty arduous process, but I'm really happy with how it turned out. So thank you again, once again, for watching. I promise I'm going to be a lot more consistent uploading. Probably not gonna make another video this long for a while, hopefully. Because this just took way too freaking long, and that's part of the reason why I didn't finish it. So thank you for watching. Please like and also subscribe if you enjoyed. And if you want to see more videos like this, I got another one. I also have a YouTube poop that I made in like I don't know, like 30 minutes. That was kind of funny. So check those out if you're interested. See ya.